Okay, so we're going to formally get started now. Welcome everybody to this session. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am zooming in from Gadigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. If you would like to acknowledge where you are zooming in from, feel free to do so in the chat. My name is Christina Ho. I am an academic here at UTS in social and political sciences, and I'll be hosting today. This is an event that is in conjunction with UTS Global Goals Month and also Social Sciences Week. So we're ticking a lot of boxes here. It is also, of course, our annual Andrew Jakubowicz public event. So special welcome to Andrew. This is an event that we do on an annual basis to acknowledge the lasting legacy of our lovely, beloved colleague, Andrew, who was a professor at UTS for many years and really established a kind of vision for our area that we are very proudly continuing. And obviously research into climate is one of those really important legacies. So we're here today to talk about climate contestation, mobilisations, intersections, possibilities. Sadly, we are missing our other colleague, James Goodman, who, really was instrumental in setting this event up, but he sends his apologies. He's down with a bad stomach bug, and he's also overseas in the UK, so I'm not sure what time of the day it is over there. But yeah, so this is an event that we're going from 12 to 1:30. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 speakers now. But in terms of introductions, this is the introduction that James gave me. With advancing climate change, there are new convergences, both against climate action and for it. What intersectional alignments emerge? How does this shift politics, local and transnational? What barriers and possibilities are created? This Social Science Week Roundtable reflects on the state of play as society responds to climate disruption. So for those of you who don't know, Social Sciences Week is something that happens across Australia and potentially beyond, trying to really showcase the potential of the social sciences to have a real world impact. So obviously, there's a lot of research into climate, and the goal of the researchers who are here today is to have that impact beyond academia, and that is the goal of Social Sciences Week, is to show us what the social sciences can do to help improve the world. So with that introduction, I'll introduce our speakers, and our first speaker, welcome, Heidi, is here. So we have Heidi, Priya, Jon, Michelle, and Julia. Each of our speakers is going to speak for around 5 or 10 minutes, and then Andrew is going to provide a discussion at the end, and hopefully we'll also have some time to open it up for some general Q&A from the floor. So Heidi, if you are ready, I'll introduce you first. So Professor Heidi Norman is a researcher in the field of Aboriginal political history and a descendant of the Gomeroi people from northwestern New South Wales. She's based at UNSW, and Heidi says at the heart of her research is her support for Aboriginal people's rightful place in the nation, especially within political institutions, in society and the economy as landholders. And she's going to be presenting today on Indigenous peoples and climate change. Thanks, Heidi. Can you please unmute?
It's good to see you all. Hi, everyone. Hope you're well. I'm looking at the time. I did have in my diary a 12:30 start, so I'm glad I jumped in early. But it's great to see you all. I do have a PowerPoint that I wouldn't mind sharing, but doesn't really matter.
Oh, if you've got it there, you can share your screen.
Yeah, it's okay. I just need to probably bring it back to here. I'll just say share, open system settings. Oh, No, that's too okay. Okay. It would require me to quit and start again, so I won't do that. But how about I just put the PowerPoint in the chat so you can have a look at it if you want to. And while I'm doing that, I'll just tell you in the few minutes what I share with you some key points. So sorry about that, I just got a bit messed up. Alrighty, so over the last couple of years, I've been working on an advisory committee, a federal government advisory committee, developing the First Nations clean energy strategy. And so I want to reflect on where that strategy has got to, and reflect on all of the incredible investment and role of government in curating the energy transformation, the various policy levers that have been enacted to bring Aboriginal interests into this policy, into the energy transformation, and then to talk about how I envisage in my mind a gap between the high level policy and thinking about the policy levers and the interventions that can be made at that level, and what happens at the ground level. And I'm going to talk about this parallels some of the things that Kyle White spoke about in the US. And I want to talk about the limitations and I guess my concerns about the working at the bigger policy and framework level, and where and how work can be engaged at more local levels to mobilize interest and engagement in what might be what a lot of people are talking about as a phenomenal opportunity or a unique opportunity in terms of Aboriginal rights and interests, and especially in a post-referendum, post-voice context, where it feels like there's a rapid decline in political motivation to recognise Aboriginal rights and interests, and where these rights and interests can be best pursued through other mechanisms, including leveraging the land estate to exercise economic uplift and ensuring rights and interests are ensured across that energy transformation. So let me just talk about three key things. One is the First Nations Clean Energy Strategy. It's gone through the ECMC in July, and that ECMC is the Federal and State Energy Ministers gathering. It's been endorsed and it will be released by December. At the moment, it's going through MyEFO Treasury to secure resources. There are three leading aspirations, or three principles that the strategy outlines. One is access to energy as a human right, ensuring Aboriginal rights and interests or inherent rights are included in the energy transformation, and the other is justice. So that would include economic benefit and other types of benefits. So in terms of human rights, this would probably be the most striking way this plays out is that across Northern Australia, many Aboriginal communities are relying on an energy system of cards, like debit cards. So you basically don't have reliable energy. It's much more expensive. It doesn't have the same regulatory government role as other like essential energy and energy providers that we have in New South Wales. So the reliance on cards, and even then the reliance on diesel in remote communities, it's not diesel backup. In some communities, even say the outlying communities around Alice Springs, it's more like about 80 to 85% diesel reliance. So that human rights dimension around energy, access to clean, affordable, reliable energy is really a vital dimension. And the diesel, transitioning off diesel, getting communities off reliance on diesel is really important. Diesel's dirty, it's expensive, it has a really high service cost. You will remind me about time, Chris, is that right? So inherent rights. So the key idea here is that free, prior and informed consent, that you'll have rights to protect culture and heritage as the energy transformation takes place on your country. And that would also include, say, in relation to critical mineral explorations and other activities that are going to rapidly expand to meet the incredibly, what will be a resource intensive transformation. And in terms of justice, there are some key aspects here, and this is largely about ensuring there's economic benefit. And at the moment, if we look at the New South Wales roadmap, that is the energy transformation framework. It does include the recognition of Aboriginal rights and interests, or First Nations rights and interests, and that is largely achieved through the development of First Nations guidelines and the requirement for proponents to meet certain criteria, merit criteria, and complete an industry Aboriginal participation plan. And it's largely confined to jobs and procurement. Another mechanism that is the Commonwealth is the Capacity Investment Scheme. So you'll know that the Capacity Investment Scheme, the tenders were opened in May of this year. It's looking to secure 6 gigawatts of renewable capacity, and as more than half of that is likely to be allocated to New South Wales. So those projects will be in New South Wales. And you will know that I'm still on the topic of justice here, and I've just got 2 points to cover off on. That the Capacity Investment Scheme, like the roadmap, it's curated by government. In terms of the Capacity Investment Scheme, that's a Commonwealth scheme. The Commonwealth government will provide a guaranteed return on investment. So the Commonwealth will catch any loss of investment, and any super profits will be shared between the proponent and the Commonwealth government. So in that context, it means that the government has lots of levers. And what we have argued here, successfully, I believe, is that what needs to be included is a consideration of equity, so ownership of projects on Aboriginal land, as well as jobs, procurement, training, a whole range of other negotiations. So the difference in the context of New South Wales, the roadmap really mapped out Aboriginal rights and interests in terms of jobs and procurement according to a merit criteria that proponents had to realise. But the Capacity Investment Scheme should be a bit different in that there should be more rights realised because there's the equity dimension. Now, the New South Wales roadmap, based on those dedicated renewable energy zones, even though this was a first example of a government curated energy transformation that included particular outcomes for Aboriginal people, they have not been met. So even though the employment target for these proponents was something like 1.5%, and the projects have been where the renewable energy zones are, say in Western New South Wales, the Aboriginal population is, say, up around 14%. And the employment on these projects has been 0.77, so less than 1%, and around about $10 million on procurement, which is well below any target, what you might have expected in terms of Aboriginal businesses and procurement. So there, again, I think there is I still can see there's really unique opportunities for Aboriginal land interests to be negotiated as part of the transformation. And there should be significant economic outcomes achieved. But again, I think there's a real gap between what's mapped out at the policy level and the work that's needed at the local level to mobilise interest and engagement. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heidi. All right, I think what we'll do is we'll move through the speakers and then we'll open it up for general discussion afterwards. So Thanks for kicking us off with that overview. We'll now move to Priya Pillai and the view from India. Priya has worked on environmental and social justice issues for 20 years. She works closely with grassroots movements and non-governmental organizations that focus on climate and energy, gender equality and forest rights. She's currently the Director of State Climate Action in India, and she's going to be talking about Global South climate justice. Thanks, Priya.
Can you see my screen? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christina. So as Christina said, I've been working on climate justice related issues for the longest time in India, but totally working on the ground first around fossil fuel related issues. And then now on renewables and the way renewables has been kind of coming into India and the kind of stuff. So when we talk about climate justice in India, I think very strongly that it's more of an existential crisis rather than an environmental issue, as opposed to what's the debate or the conversation in the Western countries. In the global South, it is more about communities. And in India, if you look at specifically, it's the Adivasis, which is basically indigenous communities, Dalits, women, and other marginalized communities who are most impacted. And the debate is not just about mitigation. Though, if you look at it, the government mechanisms, the international discussions have over a long period focused more on mitigation. What is key for India and movements and communities in the country around climate change and climate justice, it's been about adaptation and resilience building. And if you go and dig a little more deeper, I think caste, class, and gender, these three aspects are very, very key to climate justice. If you want to achieve climate justice, these three important areas. Caste is very peculiar to a country like India, where you have a lot of injustice or violations or discrimination that has historically happened and continues to happen in the name of caste. And of course, class and gender are other key issues. Now, the debate on the ground is not about climate change, whether you talk about impacts or whether you talk about solutions. We have been part of multiple movements. I've been looking at solutions as well. And in all these areas, what's key for communities is not climate change per se. Climate change is a proxy battle that's fought through, the fight to save Jal, Jungle, Zameen, as we call it in India. So it's basically Jal as in water, jungle as in forests, and Zameen as in land. So it's all these battles, against the developmental projects that are being fought on the ground to save the water, forests, as well as land, which are livelihoods closely related to communities. So whether it's fisher folk, whether it's indigenous communities, whether it's farmers, whether it's Dalits. So it's the livelihoods, it's displacement, it's access to natural resources, it's about land alienation. Of course, air pollution has become a key issue in the most recent years, especially in key cities like Varanasi, Patna, Delhi, Mumbai. But again, air pollution from the point of justice, from the point of, how are poor more impacted and how they are less resilient to the impacts. Again, there's contamination, water contamination, pollution, and it has also been very, for the ground movements and people who are fighting on the ground, it's been about their culture, it's been about their dignity as well, because most of the solutions to climate change have been market driven, and there has been it's been looked as a technocratic solution rather than a rather than a process that can enable social change as well. And what has actually motivated people to take action on climate change on the ground is basically it's the movements around climate change are built around injustice. So it's basically built around justice issues, violations, and disruptions. And there are multiple, I don't want to go into the various stories, but there are a lot of examples of ground movements on the ground where people have been fighting to save their forests. Of course, the larger debate has been, or, you can clearly build a link of, forests which essential for climate, as essential climate sinks and need protection and all of that. But on the ground, the fight has been about livelihoods. It has been about access to natural resources. It has been about, gender inequality. It has been about, caste inequality. It has been about class. Now, there's also, if you look at, the fossil fuel history of the country, it's mostly been in the central Indian belt, where the battle was, to save the forest wealth, because a lot of communities and their livelihoods were dependent. So it was more of a resource curse kind of a thing. So Mahan, Niyamgiri, as you see on the screen, are all battles that have been fought to save large patches of forests, to save lives and livelihoods of communities, to save, again, which are proxy battles which have been fought which can be brought into the area of climate change, into the area of climate justice specifically. Now, when we come to solutions, is large-scale renewable any different? So in India, the solutions, especially if you look at the energy sector, I'm not talking about transport, agriculture, and other sectors that are also transitioning. But if you look at energy transition itself, one has seen that it has primarily been basically large-scale renewable energy transition. And in the large-scale space, again, it's been mostly private-owned, corporate-owned, renewables, and that too large-scale renewables. About 99% of renewable energy projects in this country are large private-owned, renewables, and that again has posed as a big challenge in energy transition, whereby we have seen huge land grab in the country for solar. We all know that whether it was for fossil fuel, where a thermal power plant requires less than maybe 2 acres of land, but for a solar, you see that on an average per megawatt you will require 3 to 4 acres of land. So land grab and land acquisition, land alienation in various forms, not just in the form of land leases, in the form of land acquisition, in the form of open and blatant land grabs, have been a common thing on renewables again, especially large scale renewables. Water has been again a key issue. So all of this, if you look at it, livelihoods especially of communities, very, very closely linked with class and caste. The Dalits in this country, who are lower in the social caste stratification in the country, have historically owned very less land, and their livelihoods have been dependent more on commons. And now we see this whole thing of commons being siphoned off for large-scale renewables. So that's again a conflict that has kind of clearly emerged on the ground with the large-scale renewables. Again, Forest Rights Act. We've heard Heidi talking about free and prior informed consent. That is also a key battle that's been fought. In India, we have the Forest Rights Act, which is clearly not implemented on the ground, whether it's community rights or, which is equivalent, I think, in some ways to the Native Title Act in Australia. But we've seen lack of implementation. We've seen that, communities have not really benefited even from, this whole discussion around protecting carbon sinks and, the money that is due to them for that. So there are, pockets of money that are kept aside, like the CAMPA, which has been kept aside for, rejuvenating forests and setting up new forests and all of that. But none of the money for protecting forests goes to the communities, actually. So we still don't know what is the mechanism for actually transferring that money. Internationally, there's been a lot of discussion. Now, in terms of challenges, I would still say that in India, the key challenges are, of course, the strong, the way actually climate change is still seen. It is still seen as a technocratic solution as opposed to, so you have the National Climate Action Plan, you have the State Climate Action Plan, which does not actually take into account what's really happening on the ground. There is no focus on resilience building. There is no focus on adaptation. It is more mitigation centric. And you will find that state governments are taking World Bank loans to kind of set up these projects which are more mitigation focused than adaptation and resilience building. There is, of course, a very strong co-option of these words, into their vocabulary. But what is actually happening on the ground is diametrically opposite to what actually should be done. And that is actually bringing in the whole violation, discrimination aspect. And hence the movements. In terms of what is the future for climate justice, of course, very recently one has seen that, say, for example, the National Alliance of People's Movements, which is an alliance in the country which has more than 300, people's movements in the country. Only 2 years ago, they started kind of talking about climate justice and climate change. Now we see that these conversations are becoming mainstream. People have started talking about climate change. Otherwise, it was about land rights. It was about saving forests and livelihoods. It was about fisher folk and their rights. It was about women's rights. So this siloed approach to, the violations has been a challenge. But now, more recently, we are seeing those conversations being more mainstreamed and aligned now. So decarbonization has to kind of, in India, be more aligned to social justice, the aspects of caste, class, and gender. Again, when we talk about decarbonization in any sector, of course, it has to be decentralized, wherein the whole aspect of energy democracy, if you're talking about the energy sector, we need to talk about, people-owned energy systems. What happens to people's rights? Do they benefit? Again, jobs that were promised in the fossil fuel sector never came, but there is very little opportunity for jobs in the renewable energy sector. The renewable energy development is happening in two different geographies. For example, the fossil fuel region was a different geography. So once mines get shut up, thermal power plants get shut down there in the process of decarbonization, what happens to rights of laborers? Again, when you talk about labor rights in the country, there is a huge unorganized sector. The organized sector may end up, kind of bargaining and negotiating and getting something out of the whole, decarbonization process. But what happens to the huge unorganized sector out there, who is not even acknowledged as, as a sector out, and what happens to the rights, their livelihoods that are actually currently fossil fuel driven? So in one geography, which is mostly the central and the northeastern kind of geography in India, the fossil fuel, moving out or phasing out fossil fuel is a key issue, whereas growth of renewables is happening on the western part of the country. So eastern part is where the fossil fuel is, and the western part is where the new renewables is growing. So even if the jobs are created, it's not being created in the same geography, which is a big challenge. So the people who lose the jobs, the economies of entire states like Jharkhand are dependent on, so 17% of the Jharkhand's economy is fossil fuel dependent currently. So what happens to those states and their economies? There is no clear blueprint based on what's happening on the ground to kind of look at these challenges. So I personally, from our experience of having worked, realize that energy democracy, decentralized renewables, public sector, larger public sector engagement in renewables is what is key to, to kind of, in some certain ways, enable, climate justice on the ground. Again, focus on resilience building and adaptation is key. Again, there is this larger issue of how do we integrate climate change and climate justice agenda into the, larger social justice fights that exist and are fighting in silos. Of course, we are looking. We definitely hope that this transition, across sectors will reorder hierarchies and create new possibilities. But then that needs a lot of groundwork, on that. And the biggest issue here is the whole fact that the mitigation of climate change or climate justice. The biggest hurdle that it faces is that it is currently, as everywhere, it is market driven, it is profit driven, and as long as it's market driven and market based, the same issues that we faced with fossil fuel sector are going to kind of see itself replicating in the renewable sector as well, which is about injustice, which is not about climate justice. So there is a huge need, and again, we have seen a systematic on the policy front. We've seen a systematic dilution of the existing regulatory framework. There is an absence of a regulatory framework for the renewables because everything is seen as single window clearances, and there is this whole thing of green energy needs to be welcomed with both arms kind of thing. So on one hand, you have weakened the existing regulatory framework, like the Forest Rights Act, the Land Acquisition Act. Everything is being diluted, including office memorandums and state level notifications. So you will find that all of it is just enabling markets and market-based solutions, which are technology-based solutions. Social change and social justice has to come at the center of this whole transition for it to be a climate just transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. That was a real powerhouse overview of the scale of what we are talking about from an Indian perspective, but really interesting also to see the overlaps with the Australian context in relation to marginalized minorities. Thank you so much, Priya. So we will have time to come back to some of these issues at the end, hopefully in our general discussion. But I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, who is Jon Marshall, who's going to take us into the more political realm. Jonathan is an anthropologist who studies processes of disorder, disruption, and disinformation, particularly in the eco-social technical spheres. His future fellowship at UTS was a project entitled Society and Climate Change, Social Analysis of a Disruptive Technology. And he is also now a part-time lecturer in social and political sciences. Thanks, Jon.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so this presentation is basically anti-renewable action, fantasy, and the nuclear lobby. It's sort of, to some extent, about how the rhetoric of denial has actually filtered into the nuclear lobby. So the rhetoric of denial has moved from climate change is not real and don't disrupt the markets to include the idea that renewables don't work. The coalition's nuclear policy is actually so incoherent that you don't actually have to object to nuclear energy to object to it. The only reason for changing energy systems, ignoring health and the increasing energy cost of new fossil fuels, is preventing massive social disruption from climate change. So if emissions are not reduced, then there is no point changing the system. Fossil fuel companies have been warned of climate change by their own internal research since the late 1950s. Their model of climate change from the 1980s are surprisingly accurate, which is very surprising given how difficult it is to predict the actions of complex systems. They have, instead of reducing their investment in fossil fuels, spent a lot of money on delay and denial, largely through right-wing politicians and neoliberal think tanks. Their main aim seems to be to protect their profits and power with a sort of fantasy of eternal growth and eternal profits from a particular circumstance. The coalition's background is that they are pro-fossil fuel, as is fairly clearly demonstrated by their technology-neutral gas-led recovery. Dutton in 2023 was only in favor of small modular reactors. However, they do not exist commercially and are now not so central to his plans, although they're still mentioned whenever they want to say how progressive this plan is. They are also against 2030 emissions targets, as they are supposedly difficult or unobtainable, and they stress the economy. 2050 targets are enough, ignoring the buildup of emissions during that period, which will, of course, intensify climate change and make getting net zero by 2050 harder. Recently, the coalition has been campaigning against offshore wind farms and is committed to overturn the Illawarra and Port Stephens offshore wind farms. The community, they say, have the rights to object and veto development. There is, of course, no objection to offshore drilling or to more coal and gas mines, in which case they are pretty similar to Labour. Dutton's nuclear arguments circulates along these lines, that nuclear is cheap, but he has not released any costs, and this cheapness is denied by the CSIRO. They've denied it twice. A nuclear reactor will cost over $8 billion each. And their response of the coalition has not been to release their costings, but to attack the CSIRO. Also, it should be noted that with all nuclear buildings, there has been a convention of cost blowouts and time blowouts. Some of these are being significant, usually about 50% at the least. They want only 7 sites for nuclear reactors. Now, nuclear reactors generate about 1.3 gigawatts. We currently have 22 gigawatts of coal. So we would need at least 16 reactors to replace the coal that is currently being phased out or falling apart. The Australian Energy Market Operator also estimates that Australia will need at least 300 gigawatts of power, electricity, by 2050. The coalition have said that Australia, with their plan, does not need large-scale renewables, and so they will cap renewable development. Consequently, they would, to meet the 300 gigawatts thing, they would have to increase gas or coal, or keep coal to fill the energy gap. So they're promising to spend at least 55 billion and possibly 100 billion or more of taxpayers' money not to reduce emissions or fossil fuel use. There are no current private interests in funding nuclear. So the exercise is completely pointless unless the aim is to protect fossil fuel use. How do they go about trying to persuade people that nuclear is good in this case? Their problem is Labour's expensive renewables only approach is failing, which it may well be doing, given that the government does not seem that keen on it and there are huge delays happening. It also is the case that the nuclear proposals have already scuppered several investments in renewable energy, given that they know that this nuclear energy and renewables are not compatible. They claim that nuclear energy is reliable, steady, and cheap, and it will cut the cost of living. However, at best, this cut of costs of living will not happen for 15 years. There are no new cables, no batteries. They also say it will be quick. All the construction will be finished in the 2030s. Coal expires before then. The AEMO is worried about 2025 as a possible deadline. The quickest build in a non-experienced country has been 13 years in the United Arab Emirates. We have no idea of the cost of that. So given that it will take 2 years to pass legislation to make it legal and to do the promised consultations, that means that the nuclear energy will not be ready until 2040 at best, most likely 2045 or 50. They also argue that nuclear energy is long-lasting, between 80 to 100 years. I would point out, of course, that we haven't had nuclear energy for 100 years. No reactors have yet reached 60. They also say that everybody else is doing it, so we should do it too. But nuclear energy has been roughly steady over the last 20 years. 102 reactors have opened and 104 have shut down. The main argument when it comes down to it is the fantasy that nuclear energy is somehow far more powerful than coal energy, which it is not. There are obvious problems here, namely unflexible generation like coal. So you have to suppress our renewable energy peaks to keep nucleus profitable. Nuclear energy has the ongoing costs of fuel, damage from mining, transport of radioactive supplies and waste, often through residential areas. There is no details on waste disposal at all. And it also will send money overseas for building. So this $100 billion will largely go to overseas companies. There is no community right of rejection in the national interest of nuclear energy, according to their policy. Unlike, of course, renewables, where community veto is vital. There is also a political ban on nuclear energy in Australia, and there is no political support for its repeal. Furthermore, it fails to produce enough energy for 2050 without a massive simultaneous build, and simultaneous builds are not easy. They also seem to live in a fantasy, and this is the one thing I want to share, if I can share the screen. Okay, can you see the slide? Okay, Peter Dutton has tweeted that this image is the concept design of a zero-emissions small modular reactor. However, of course, it is fairly obvious it's designed for a building and setting. It could be a cheese factory. It tells us nothing about how the SMR is supposed to work, what the materials it will be constructed out of, how it's built, what the cooling system is, what the safety system is, where the uranium and waste is stored. This concept design does not even have a fence. It is about as low security as you can get. This is an empty piece of fantasy, but shows how the coalition are building their nuclear energy proposals. So in summary, the 7 to 14 reactors being proposed will not replace the coal energy being phased out or breaking down. Australia will, without significant change, need more energy and more electricity. The reactors will not add to this without them being built. As I said earlier, building simultaneously is difficult. The coalition will at best slow renewable rollouts, so coal and gas will have to be increased to make up the shortfall. In other words, they will increase emissions. They have also not announced any plans whatsoever to do anything to reduce other sources of emissions, including agriculture and concrete. The plan, therefore, does nothing to reduce emissions or reach net zero. It just spends lots of money. Hence, there is no reason whatsoever to utilize it. However, it does support fossil fuel profits and stops the spread of renewables, which is probably its aim. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon.
Yeah. How do I get rid of this?
You can just press on stop sharing.
Okay. Where's stop sharing? Okay, where is stop sharing? I have got no stop sharing button. Ah, there it is. Yay, got it. Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Jon. All right, so let's move on to Michelle, who is also talking about the political sphere, but from a different perspective, looking at from the bottom up rather than looking at from what policymakers or political leaders might be doing. So she's going to be talking about youth climate protest. Michelle is a lecturer in design, visual communication within the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University. She's also a research fellow at the Young and Resilient Research Centre. She draws on practical industry experience to produce outcome-driven work with a focus on creating innovative approaches to engage and connect with young people, industry, and the broader community. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I just want to begin today. Obviously, I'll be talking about climate action and climate justice. And I just want to premise my talk with the fact that we can't have climate justice without justice for First Nations people, and that this includes processes of decolonisation and returning the land to traditional owners who've looked after and cared for country for tens and thousands of years. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about an Australian Research Council project that I'm a CI on, and it's called New Possibilities, Young People and Democratic Renewal. This project, you're using the word a lot, John, veto. This was vetoed originally under the Liberal government, despite being approved by the Council of Experts. It was vetoed by the Education Minister because researching young people's climate action was not value for taxpayers' dollars. But it was then successfully funded the following year under a change of government. So I always think that's a nice way to sort of start the kind of political nature of some of this research, especially when we're thinking about the involvement of young people. So a really broad transdisciplinary team are involved in this. We come from multiple universities, we have a lot of student researchers on our team, and we also work with youth organisations. And I want to say a special shout out to Danusha Su, who's a student researcher and associate who's undertaken this analysis with me. So our research sort of more broadly aims to understand the school strike for climate in the Australian context. We want to know who's taking part, how they're acting politically, what they're saying and how are people responding to what they're actually saying, and what those implications are for contemporary democracy. So we've collected data at every Sydney-based strike since 2019. Alongside that, we've also analysed the speeches, we've conducted interviews and surveys, that's across the broad team, but I'm leading the component on the visual communication of the protests. So I'm going to talk through some high-level insights today. Along with student researchers, we've analysed close to 1,500 placards that have been held by young people at the strikes from 2019 to now, and our analysis is ongoing. The majority of these are captured from Sydney, but we've also gathered data from Brisbane, Northern Rivers, Castlemaine and Melbourne, and ACT. So for many young people, the protests are a unique space for their political voice, including messages delivered through signs and placards that carry diverse images, words, slogans, and metaphors. Now, we know that signs and placards are deliberately made to be read by a public audience, and that could be peers, politicians, or policymakers. So the aim of this research was to kind of gather all of these visuals together and analyse the messages on the signs to better understand not only why young people are protesting, but understand some of their demands for climate action. And I guess a real big picture aim is to think about how we can make sense of these messages with young people, to package these up to deliver convincing messages to people who have the power to change things, or people who will listen. And I think it's raised a lot of questions for myself and for the research team as well of what it means to be a good adult ally in the climate movement, and what can we do to support young people protesting and also understand how they're feeling. So we know that visual communication is a really effective tool to communicate about the environmental impacts of the climate crisis. And when most people think about climate change, you probably conjure up images like polar bears on melting ice caps, raging fires, plastic waste, and logged forests. And young people today have really grown up surrounded by these kind of images. So it's no surprise that these iconic images are then remixed into the placards that young people are holding, pleading for change. This sense of environmental loss and conservation concerns is a consistent theme in the placards and highlights the threats felt by young people to the things that they care about. This sort of natural destruction imagery formed the dominant public imaginary for many years when one thought about climate change. But I think with the resurgence of the school strike for climate, now when people think about climate change, they also think about climate action and the school strike for climate movement. And this sort of brings new images to the fore. So, we see things like students en masse, images of Greta Thunberg alongside other activists that aren't always represented as recurrently in the media, and young kids participating in mass global action. Now, the strikes are increasingly intersectional, and young people communicate an understanding of the fact that the forces of oppression, such as patriarchal society, capitalism, and colonization, are contributing to the climate crisis. Young people are experiencing and expressing the climate crisis through a feminist perspective, or a type of kind of popular feminism. Feminist representations persist in other ways as well, which isn't surprising, as this is a predominantly female-led movement. So on average, 70% of the people holding the signs at the protest that we've captured are women or young girls. And it's important to note that that's not an empirical analysis of everybody that is at the site. strike, sorry. But what it does tell us is that girls and young women at the protests are demanding an increase in the particular kind of visibility that they, wanted to direct and deliver to specific audiences. And this is consistent with a global study in 2020 by Demore that noted that the September 2019 mobilisations were 60% female and young women, and they strongly outnumbered men. So how this is communicated is in lots of different ways. Some use humour to communicate this, others use solidarity, others use it to place blame on systems like the patriarchy. Oh, I missed a slide. But what's important to note is that the signage demonstrates that no one, and especially those in power, are immune to the climate crisis. Young people are trying various tactics to connect with or make people feel something. And this role of emotions in the movement is really important. Science as an issue rarely appears in the signs. For young people, they're not using stats to communicate the issue. It's a human issue, it's an emotional issue. And so as part of this, we've done a semiotic analysis where we started to decode the signage with student researchers to understand the political emotions that are present in some of the signage. So this is the overall emotions across the 4 years. So humor is, where they're sort of using sarcasm or amusing sort of techniques to communicate their ideas. And whilst it's really good to look at this across 2019 to 2023, it's important to note that the signage at each people assume that the signage at each sort of event or protest will be consistent, but empirically these events, people and the artifacts change over time. So whilst these are aggregated stats, this looks different when we start to break that down and look at individual emotions across individual points in time. So this is because protests reflect dynamic local and global events and processes of change in political parties, laws, policies, and institutional settings. So a perfect example of this, some of you might have already clocked the dates, is that we can see the emotions shift in the lead up to the last federal election in Australia, which was held on the 21st of May, 2022. So at this process, highlighted in pink, anger is at its peak with the highest percentage across the 4 years. Anger and frustration are grouped together here because when we sort of started this analysis, we had them as separate categories, but the research from the feedback from student researchers is that, from a semiotic perspective, they can effectively kind of be folded together because of the semiotic and textual sort of similarities in some of the ways that they're communicated. So at this pre-election strike, unsurprisingly, there was a higher percentage of posters that linked directly on voting. And, there's a big background to that conversation around lowering the voting age and the fact that, young people have to live with the devastating consequences of the climate crisis, but are not allowed to weigh in on the future of the country and who will lead it. There's defamation and, cases of pointing the finger at specific political leaders in power, and there's no surprise why this may be the case in this instance. But there's also not only messages about blame, but also young people demonstrate understandings of potential solutions or policies that could be amended to create action or change. And there's also sort of an inherent relationship with education. So there's, a lot of stuff around missing classes to educate leaders, but there's also a desire for more education. And we see this come through calling for First Nations-led solutions and climate justice as well. So this data reinforces how the elements of time and place influence the visual voices and intentions of specific protests. So here we can see, following the change in political party, that the anger dropped by 15% at the next strike, but was beginning to rise as the Albanese Labor government at the time of the last strike that we've coded had demonstrated no interest in changing the coalition government's commitment to the fossil fuel industries. So we're seeing sort of a new shift in who young people are addressing. The sign on the left was outside of Tanya Plibersek's office, and more sort of target protests are occurring as well. So the image on the right of DJ Albo was in May this year, and that was directly outside of Parliament House, where young people, First Nations people, Doctors for Climate, and DJ Albo himself came together to demand stronger environmental laws and an end to new approval of coal and gas. So the reality is that young people have been striking for 4 years and we've not seen enough change in response to these actions. And I think this really does beg the question of who is listening, what does listening look like, and how effective is all of this communication, and what more can we do to support young people and young people's futures in the climate crisis. And that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That's so evocative. And great to have that more hopeful kind of depiction of the overall topic of climate contestations. We are now going to go on to Julia Scott-Stevenson, who is talking about diverse imagination and climate futures. Julia is a researcher, maker, and curator of interactive and immersive factual media. Her current Chancellor's Fellowship project uses practice-led research to explore how immersive media, that is virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, can address the climate crisis. So over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. So yes, as Chris said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research project on, it's titled Envisaging and Enacting Just Climate Futures Through Immersive Media. I'll share my screen in a moment, but I'll get started first. So looking at the range of issues we've heard about already across Indigenous leadership in renewables, action in India, youth protest, and the nuclear issue, we can see just how much climate crisis gets its tendrils into absolutely everything, and what a diverse and complex concept and set of concepts it is, and how this, and I'm interested in how this can really become incredibly overwhelming for people. So we might say that there's kind of a spectrum of climate crisis perhaps, and at one end of that spectrum you've got this incredibly enormous, overwhelming, knotty issue that we can't conceive of, or yeah, come on, I think I've got a copy delivery arriving as well, that we can't possibly conceive of, thank you, or you know, figure out how to even address or conceive of, let alone address. And then at the other end of that spectrum, we've got this kind of hyper-individual approach, which is it's all up to us, stop using plastic straws, recycle, buy a electric vehicle, that kind of thing. And so I'm interested in finding, is there a spot somewhere in the middle of that spectrum where people can feel like they have some agency in this space? How do we do that? And how might creative practice help us build a public discourse in which we can feel that agency? So as Chris mentioned, by immersive media, I mean anything that uses technology and actively involves the audience. It might be virtual reality, augmented reality, or even projections or immersive audio. And part of the research is also figuring out which of those forms might be appropriate. I come from an expanded documentary practice background, which informs a lot of this work. And when I speak about creative practice, I mean media works and artworks that contribute towards building this cultural imagination that I'm talking about. So I'm very much not framing this as a really instrumental approach in which we measure how many people have attended a particular media event and then can tick a box afterwards to say they are now going to put solar panels on their home, for instance. It's much more about contributing to this socio-ecological imagination. So the first creative output from this project was called Collective Visions, and it showed as part of Climate Action Week Sydney, which was in May this year. And it was in the UTS Data Arena, which is a 360-degree visualization facility, which is the fancy way of saying a very large kind of circular screen room. And I'll just put up some images. Okay, great. And so what people could do was they would enter the space. On one side, there was a QR code, and they could scan that QR code with their phone, and on their browser would pop up a request for them to answer this question: what is your hoped for climate future? And audiences would craft a prompt that would describe what their hoped for climate future was. And in about 10 seconds, an image generated by AI would pop up on their phone. And if they liked the image, they could choose to submit it to the collage, and it would, if they chose yes, it would immediately appear on this screen around them. And the collage built collectively across the 5 days of Climate Action Week. So this first image you can see is from the first day, the end of the first session on the first day, when a few images had started to be contributed. Now let's see if I can. This image was the second day. We'd started to get a few more images appearing. And then we can dig into some of the images more generally. Here in the middle, I think we have a whole bunch of bicycles and an outdoor movie screen. We saw quite a bit of sort of urban spaces with greenery. This one in the top right's a little hard to see, but I think that was a kind of a legislative chamber. So politics did make an appearance as well. A lot of really kind of lovely rich green spaces. And then we also started to get into some much more abstract imagery. So this one I find quite compelling over here, this kind of urban earth. I think the prompt for that one was simply the word degrowth. And then up top left, we've got, I think this one was described as the end of capitalism, which is a lot of men in suits around a large pile of money. And then we started to get into the much more really abstract kind of notions. The early sessions, we saw a lot of kind of greenery in urban spaces, renewable energy forms, and then it really started to kind of expand out into much more imaginative approaches. And so we had some of this melding of like human and flora and fauna, some really kind of speculative alternative housing and infrastructure systems. And I think we've got a friendly robot hiding behind there as well. And some really wonderful kind of mushroom houses and things started to appear as well. Actually, I'll come back to that one just for now. So we also had some guiding questions that would help spark people's thinking. Things like, what kind of scale are you thinking? Do you want to see a full cityscape, or are you imagining the scale of a single seed? Is that kind of an image that you'd be interested in? What sector of life are you talking about? Leisure, work, family? Who's in this image? Is it people? Is it animals? Is it robots? And there was also a rolling list of prompts, the text prompts on one side of the screen, so that people could see what other people had submitted. So there are two main focuses here to the research. One is looking collectively at the grouping of images that were created and how they evolved over the days, and how the text and what text prompts were used. And then gleaning from that what kind of future people found they could imagine, what kind of themes emerged, that sort of thing. And secondly, I wanted to see if there is an element of the collective experience of actually participating in this that itself contributes to this discourse of agency. So does simply participating in a group activity and seeing that other people also have visions of a positive future mean that audiences might feel a part of something that helps them in the face of climate doom? Now, I haven't quite finished crunching the data yet, but there are some interesting themes emerging. And it was clear from watching people interact that there was something to be gained from participating, from the process of entering this space, of engaging with the work and engaging with other people who were doing this too. Now you have, actually, I will click to, and this was the final day collage of where we got to at the end of 5 days of contributions. Now, you may all have felt this to a greater or lesser extent, but there's something about talking about futures that can be a little bit unmoored, a little bit abstract. It really needs a framework around it to help us kind of find actual meaning in it. And suggesting we can predict a clear future, I think, is missing the point with a project like this. And I'm not claiming that any of these individual resultant images contain any kind of truth to them. And I'm certainly not claiming that AI is going to predict this future for us. It's the process itself that I think is revealing. A few people who came to the exhibition commented on the difficulty of coming up with what they wanted to see, of answering that question about what their hoped for climate future was. The apocalypse is easy to visualize. We see it already all around us, all around the world: floods, bushfires, ice shelf collapse. So we know already what that looks like. But actually, what we want to see. It's difficult to articulate in specifics, and it also involves bearing our soul a little bit, which can be sometimes intimidating. Using generative AI in this instance, it shortcuts some of that difficulty in articulation with the support of the guiding questions, of seeing others' prompts and images. That all of that is kind of additional grist that helps us start to visualize this future that we want. And so that's some of that framework that I think that we need when looking forwards. And what the collective approach does is it reduces some of that vulnerability. It's not just me bearing my soul, it's all of these other people in the room together as well. So the framing of the question was also important. It wasn't, what do you think the future holds? It's, what do you want it to hold? So taking that really intentional or normative approach, that framing seeds this initial idea of agency that I want to dig into. So I hope that this in some way contributes to helping build that collective imagination and a feeling that there are others who also have some idea of a hopeful future. I think I'm going to keep that nice and short because we're probably getting towards the end and it'll be great to have some time for questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. And yeah, interesting to see like such a different way of looking at visual imagery to what Michelle has just described previously. But yeah, such evocative ways of depicting and imagining climate. So now we come to Andrew, who is our discussant, and he's going to make some responses to these diverse papers. Andrew, the bio that Andrew has on the UTS website is really out of date. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to use that, but Andrew is a professor of sociology and worked at UTS for many years, and has done a lot of work around multicultural communities and their experiences of social change. So I'll let him to do any updates that he might like to do to introduce himself and respond to our presenters. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you all. I'm on the land of the Bidjigal people. I'm very happy to join in today. I was trying to work out how on earth I could manage this exercise, and I want to keep it really tight because lots of people want to talk about stuff rather than listen to me chat. But when I was listening to Julia, I thought this is actually quite interesting because when I was playing with this whole idea of making a contribution today and trying to bring everything together in some way, I thought back to about 19, dare I say, the point at which I was entering the academic world. And there were two major exercises in that year, both of which were visioning exercises, which were both they were both looking forward to what was likely to happen if the world didn't change and try to understand what was going on. So they both had an aspirational dimension and a apocalyptic dimension. And the two exercises I just want to refer to briefly because it raises their perceptions raise questions for everybody, I think, today. Those two exercises were the limits of growth, which was done by a group of MIT academics working with Jay Forrester around computer modeling of world systems, and Paul Ehrlich's zero population growth, or the population time bomb, zero population growth project. And I think what was fascinating for me listening to today compared to all that is that population growth as a problem seems to me to have disappeared out of the climate change story. Now, I don't know. I mean, I think there are many, many reasons that has happened, but some of it has to do with the quite important political perspectives that everyone brought up. Heidi, Priya, Jon, and Michelle, in particular. that problem is that as the limits of growth model continues, and I mean, I think the limits of growth model from 50 years ago has been demonstrably shown to be an adequate model, which is getting more and more problematic for the world. That the costs, well, I'll put it a different way, that the benefits that the climate change debate are seeking to generate are benefits essentially for the more affluent, powerful parts of the planet. And the costs associated with generating those benefits are being carried primarily by the poorer, less affluent, less powerful parts of the planet. So Heidi's perspective, for instance, demonstrates exactly that problem, that there is a symbolic and possibly practical recognition that the landmass of Australia has essentially been appropriated by the colonial peoples and their descendants, are essentially controlled by the affluent elites of the colonial peoples. But there has been, through Aboriginal Indigenous mobilisation, there has been increasing recognition of how that is impacting, and there's been a continuing or an increasing empowerment by Indigenous peoples over how they want to try and modify that's the situation which would otherwise emerge, and that justice, as she says, will be part of this, very much part of this story. And this return to the idea of justice, I think, is a really interesting one, because it emerges over and over again. What does justice actually mean in an environment where over the last 50 years, the population of the planet has doubled? And that the makeup of those populations, if I can use the old terminologies of first world, third world, the makeup of those populations has changed quite dramatically, and that the least powerful parts of the world contain most of the young people, and the currently most powerful parts of the world contain most of, or an overwhelming proportion within their own populations of old people. Now, one of the things that the limits of growth said was there are really two ways forward, right? And they took on board population, industrialization, pollution, and so on. They said there's really two ways forward. Either there will come a point somewhere within the next 100 years, that's from the early 1970s, when there will be catastrophic changes in population and production. Right? They didn't say all that much about climate change, but one can see the climate change dimension of that contributing to those cataclysmic or catastrophic changes. Or there will be a recognition that the world system has to be adapted so that the issues that are producing the outcomes that are highly predicted and most likely can be ameliorated as much as possible. And climate change is only one of those, because where you have the numbers of people that we have on the planet is quite simply the case that over the next generation, this is not a really survivable option. And we're seeing this all over the place. We're seeing it in the catastrophic impacts in parts of Africa. We're seeing it in a lot of the climate change stuff. We're seeing it in ethnic cleansing wars, which are going on in a number of places, some more or less more recognised, some less. And so I think one of the important things that I've gained from listening to the papers, to Jon Marshall, Julia, Priya, Heidi, is the sense that mobilisation has to be more than, how can I put it, self-centred. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. Most mobilisation tends to be self-centred, which is understandable. That's what social movements are about. But a lot of the mobilisation required to actually come to grips with the sorts of predictions that we're seeing requires people who have a lot to give up much, or give up a lot of what they have, but also people who have very little to moderate to some extent their aspirations. And that, I think, is a really challenging set of dynamics. And that's where I'd like to leave it for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, lots to think about there. With that huge range of questions, and I'd like to open it up to the floor just in our remaining time. If anybody would like to ask a question or provide a comment to one or more of the speakers, please go ahead. You can use the raise hand function or just unmute yourself and talk. Julia, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. I have a question for Michelle, actually. I'm really interested in your research process and the use of student researchers as well, and whether that or whether their input has adapted or adjusted your approach to the research and how you're looking at the data.
Yeah, pretty much everything we do is co-analyzed with students. We use a Gertz's thick approach. So we sort of, consider the thin research that we're gathering is that when we shoot at the strikes and when we capture the data, we've got students that are shooting alongside us. We've got students that are surveying people in the field and so on. So we're sort of everybody's all working together. And then we work up from the data with student researchers. So we sort of, we do sort of very emergent themes based on what we're sort of seeing. So some of the stuff that we started with has shifted and changed over time based on what students are picking up. With this stuff, we've done sort of a few different ranges. So I just talked today about the emotions we've coded on the signs looking at them, but we've also we've asked people in the strikes how they're feeling, which is very different. There's sort of a really interesting tension between loud and quiet emotions. So there's a lot more fear, a lot more anxiety, whereas the signs are more empowered and motivated because of the context of the protest itself. And then we've also started doing research where we're actually getting young people to read the signage and reflect on how they make them feel and how likely they are to drive them to action, but also how likely they might be to drive others to act in power. So interestingly, any of the signs that are really crass or have lots of swear words or are really abrupt, the focus groups that we've run, young people are just like, you're just detracting from the issue. Like, I understand that you're angry, but this isn't actually helping anyone. And that's sort of where we're seeing that sort of move towards young people wanting, and this isn't all young people, obviously, this is just based on the groups that we've worked with, but wanting more clearer pathways to education, clearer pathways to action, clearer pathways to connect with people in power is part of some of the stuff that's coming out as well. So yeah, we do everything that we do is with young people at the same time.
Thanks, Michelle. There's another question for you in the chat from Liam. And he's asking, what's your assessment of the current strength of the school strikes? Especially interested to hear more about how their anger subsided with the election of Labor and is now rising again.
The strength of the strikes. I think, I don't think I can answer that, but I do think that there is a move there is a sort of shift within the movement where young people seem to be organising in different ways other than just street protests. So there's things like there's a lot more solidarity building and community building, but then also larger things like the blockade in Newcastle, some of those more traditional protest actions that are putting a stop to environmental acts in the field. So I don't know if I can sort of say how effective they are. I think we've looked at the different way that media has responded to the strikes, and with a change of government, there's definitely a more sympathetic view of the strikes and that young people should have an opinion, but where those opinions go and what that means, I mean, yeah, I think everybody here probably, you know, is on the same page with that. So I'm not sure. I think that there seems to be less strikes happening, so that could be indicative of how the movement themselves are feeling about it too.
Anyone else got a question? I've got Luigi, go ahead.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I've got a question for Julia. Because I was fascinated by the method and the outputs that you mentioned in your presentation, and I was wondering, I guess from an academic point of view, how you translate these like creative outputs that you got there into academic publication, and as well as an academic method, that makes sense like in a journal article format.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Luigi. Probably in a couple of ways. So there's an increasing recognition within the academic fields of creative practice as a research method in its own right. So on the one hand, the project output is a research output of its own. That's sort of the expression of a range of research that I've done into exhibition formats and media interaction for audiences. So that's one part of it. But yes, of course, I also need to write this up in forms that are perhaps more understandable for a traditional academic audience. So part of that, there's a couple of different ways I'll do that. One will be a kind of more classic social science analysis of the text prompt data. So kind of crunching that through what themes emerged in the actual text that people submitted, and looking at themes that came through from the images themselves as well. And also, I didn't do on this first time round, but next there'll be a next iteration of Collective Visions in which I'll also be doing audience research. So surveying audiences and actually talking to them about what it made them feel, what it meant to them to participate in a project like that. Whether it made sense, whether they were getting the things that they wanted out of it. But it is kind of a fine line as well in asking audiences what they got from that, and then kind of taking those sort of next steps towards and saying, and how do you now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how doomed are we now that you've participated in a project like that, which is sort of slightly less helpful, I think. So yeah, it definitely takes some finessing, kind of wrangling a creative practice output into something that also fits some of those more traditional academic outputs.
A creative process in itself, Julia.
Yes, precisely.
I just have one last question, and it can be, I was particularly interested to hear from potentially Heidi or Priya about the idea of justice that Andrew mentioned. We were turning to justice, and I'm wondering whether the concept of climate justice is a useful one in terms of political mobilization. I wonder if either Heidi or Priya would like to speak about that.
I can say something briefly. So I in my calculation, the human rights, inherent rights, and justice dimension is really about the distribution of wealth. And it's not just about the distribution of wealth, it's the possibility that decentralized energy systems and new economies actually create opportunities for Aboriginal people in a different way. And procurement is one thing, so support for individual entrepreneurs, that's been a big government initiative, and they can cite success. There is success. But when it's linked to the land estate, there's a collectivist dimension. So these are collectivist enterprises, if you like, and it's about shaping particularly regional economies, which is, say through the microgrids and even in the renewable energy zones. They're not the Greater Sydney area where most people are, blackfellas have been able to secure some foothold in the economy. But outside of those areas in regional centres, there is a possibility that you can build build economies so that you can survive on country. And at the risk of just over talking, what I'm saying there is in places like Brewarrina and Tibooburra, Wilcannia even, there, if the Land Council has land, they could host renewable energy projects like microgrids. They can then, thinking about what they said when we were out there doing field work, they were imagining the kids in schools monitoring the project would be part of the curriculum. It would create career pathways. It would contribute to energy security. It would change their esteem and standing in the community, the Land Council and Aboriginal people. So that, in a sense, justice for me is a broad, has multiple possibilities, and the energy system transformation and the Aboriginal land estate could come together in quite unique ways to realise that, when all other sort of big economic transformations and the colonial economy, for instance, those opportunities have never been presented.
Thanks, Heidi. Priya, did
Yeah.
you want to say anything about that?
Yes, I think I totally agree with Heidi. I think justice is very, very broad, as I see it also. It's systemic. It is challenging the current, capitalist paradigm. It is about decentralization. And when I say it's about decentralization, it's about ownership. It's about control. It's about governance. People, what role will be there. It's about decision making. So it's all of these aspects, I think, that are very key. It's about, as Heidi said, there are models, in India that are emerging, wherein people-owned energy systems. People have, whether it's cooperatives, energy cooperatives, or societies, consumer societies. We are currently, I'm working on something like, which is called a prosumer, collective, which we are trying to kind of look at all the people who've put solar rooftops. How do you collectivize them? How can they actually take on the mantle of selling energy to the DISCOM, as opposed to large scale, corporates selling them? How do you have control and ownership of your future energy systems? It's about energy self-sufficiency. So it's much, much broad. And in all of this, how do you address, for India specifically, the dimension of caste, the dimension of class and, gender into all of this? All of this is interwoven into it. And in this process, how do you kind of build resilience for communities like farmers, fisher folk? How do you kind of enable their livelihoods through this energy transformation? So I think all of this is very, very interconnected and needs to be clearly addressed for it to be a just transition in any form.
Thanks, Priya. We're pretty much out of time now, so I would just like to end by thanking all of our presenters for such evocative and incisive presentations. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who came along to be part of this. And happy Social Sciences Week to everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Chris.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.